Good morning, everyone. Today we start a new sermon series. This one is inspired by a series that was preached at North Point Church in Atlanta several years ago, developed by Pastor Andy Stanley and his team. He points out something early in that first sermon that we all know, but we don't talk about very much, which is that he says Christianity is a little bit odd if you think about it. It's kind of an odd religion or odd religious faith because it's all about a relationship with an invisible being, with a God that we can't see. I mean, we do believe that the invisible God took on human form in the person of Jesus, that Jesus came and lived among us as a flesh and blood person for probably about 3 or 3.5 years. But near the end of that time, one of the things he said to his disciples was, "I will be with you always." And then he went away. So we're left with developing a relationship with an invisible God. One of the things that Jesus also said to his disciples around the same time was, "Remain in me as I remain in you." Remain in me as I remain in you. Clearly an invitation to relationship, but not a lot of specifics on how to do that, about how to remain in him. He does say that one of the things it means is to follow his commands or to follow his instructions. But we know that you don't build a relationship only by following the rules or the instructions of another person. There's more to it than that. I think too often we do try to make our Christian faith or our following of Jesus mostly about rules and keeping rules and meeting requirements. And I understand that. I think that's understandable because it would be simpler that way. Go to church a certain number of times in a month. Check, I can do that. I know if I did that or not. Give away 10% of your income. Check, I can tell specifically whether I did that or not. Care for the poor. Check. Serve somebody. Check. I can focus specifically on those activities. I think for too many people, that's what the Jewish approach to God seems to have become. Too many people in the Old Covenant were following God in that mindset. But the true goal of the Old Covenant, I believe, was fairly similar to the true goal of the New Covenant, and that is for people to grow in their relationship with God, to follow God's instructions, but because they were responding to his initiative in their lives out of gratitude and out of their devotion to him. So that we're doing those specific activities, but they grow out of a heart of gratitude and of love for God, of response to God. The goal was for them to have a harmonious relationship with God, and from that to love and serve. But too many of them treated him like an ordinary God of the time, like a small g God of the ancient peoples around them, whose demands you had to meet to keep them happy. So, for instance, make the right sacrifices. Check. At the right times. Did I do that? Yep. Okay, check. Follow the detailed rules. Have I done that enough? So that those were very specific ways to tell whether you were in right standing with God. Our scripture today from the book of Hebrews talks about this. The book of Hebrews was written to Jewish Christians. That's why it's called Hebrews. It was written as a letter to them. Jewish Christians were very familiar with temple worship, very familiar with the law, and with the customs that the Jewish people had developed around keeping the law and around temple worship. Many of the Jewish Christians were probably among the most faithful to some of those traditions, because those were their habits. Those were the ways that they honored God and followed him. But Jewish Christians had put their faith in Jesus, and they'd placed their trust and their hope in his sacrifice for them. So this is a huge theme actually in the letters that we have in the New Testament as our books of the New Testament. This huge theme of calling Jewish Christians to a whole new way of thinking about their old religious habits. What does it mean for me to follow God? How do I do that? I mean, they knew that the old was gone and that the new had come, but what does that specifically mean for them? How did they work that out in specific terms? Well, we have some of the answer to that in our scripture for today, starting in verse 19 of Hebrews 10, where the writer says, "Since we have confidence to enter into the most holy place, let's do that." Since we have confidence to enter into the most holy place, let's enter in. The most holy place was also known as the Holy of Holies. It was the part of the temple where God's presence was understood to dwell. God dwelt among his people by being in the Holy of Holies within the temple. But the ordinary person, it would never have occurred to the ordinary Jewish person to even aspire, to hope to be able to enter into the Holy of Holies, because the only person who was allowed to go in there, and then this person was the high priest, and then the high priest was only allowed to go in once a year. That's because the holy and terrifying presence of God was there. But the writer of Hebrews says that because of Jesus' life and death and sacrifice, his resurrection, everything has changed for us. Everything has changed. We've now been invited into the very presence of God himself. In verse 19, he says, we've been invited in by the blood of Jesus rather than by the blood of an animal sacrifice. And verse 20 says, we've been invited to enter in by a new and living way opened for us through the curtain. Opened for us through the curtain, as though Jesus had opened this curtain, which was this heavy veil that separated the Holy of Holies from the rest of the inside of the temple area. It says, we've been invited to enter by a new and living way, opened for us through the curtain, so that we can walk right into the very presence of God himself. And so verse 22, the writer says, so let's do that. Let's draw near to God. Let's draw near to God. Because everything that previously stood between us and God has been removed by the sacrifice of Jesus. All of the sin in our lives, all of the impure thoughts in our hearts, all of the evil desires in our hearts have all been forgiven because of the sacrifice of Jesus. And so we have been invited to have a relationship with God himself. We've been invited into his presence as though entering into the Holy of Holies. And so let's take advantage of that opportunity. Let's draw near to God as he's invited us to. Let's move in God's direction. Let's draw near to God with a sincere heart, he says in verse 22. Sincere here, the word translated sincere means a true heart, or a heart that is not insincere. In other words, we're not doing this for somebody else's benefit, to please someone else. We're not doing it half-heartedly. No, we're entering in, we're drawing near to God with sincere hearts, with hearts that are devoted and that truly want to do this, that aren't worried about the words that we say, the forms that we use. We just want to be with God. We're going to be drawing near out of our devotion and our gratitude to him. The writer also says, draw near to God with full assurance that faith brings. With full assurance that faith brings. Fully confident that Jesus has opened the way for us. We've been cleansed, we've been washed. References to other temple rituals. But he says, come as you are. You are the followers. You are the children of God. Come as you are. Whatever you think was in the way, has been in the way, Jesus has dealt with it. So let's draw near to God. The writer goes on in verse 23 to also say, let us hold unswervingly to the hope we profess. And in verse 24, let us consider how we may spur one another on toward love and good deeds. We only have time today to talk about the first of those three let us instructions or invitations, but the others are worth examining at another time and worth your meditation, worth your mulling over. So my first main point for us today is that all of us are invited, all of us are urged and called to draw near to God. And the second main point for today is that we all do that in different ways. We're all called to draw near to God, but we all do that in different ways. Have you ever thought about how different ones of your friends like to connect with you in different ways or around different interests? Some of your friends probably always want to do something when you get together. They want to go somewhere. Maybe it's out to eat. Maybe they want to go on a trip together. Or maybe it's they want to go shopping together. Or they want to go hunting together. Whatever it is that you enjoy doing with them, they always want to do something. Others of your friends enjoy sitting and talking. They want to catch up with you by hanging out with you. But talking with you. If you're a little bit younger, you may have friends who mostly want to play video games with you or watch TV with you or go to a movie, watch a movie with you. That's the main thing that they want to do. So you do different things with different friends. I know I have friends who our bond is around interest in church or interest in pastoral ministry. And so we talk about that. That's what connects us. Other friends of mine enjoy travel. And so we may talk about travel. We might travel together. Other friends enjoy good food. So we go out to eat together, or we talk about restaurants that we've enjoyed in the Lancaster area, new restaurants that maybe we haven't tried. I have other friends who like good books, other friends who like to talk about sports, others who like to talk about photography. And so I have different interests, a wide range of interests that I share with a number of different people. I don't think I have many friends that share all of those interests because my pathway, my style is unique. And I think probably the same thing is true for you. So the simple truth is that although we all draw near to God through Jesus, the way to God for all of us is through Jesus. The way we do that, the way we draw near, will do in different ways. I think it's just really important to understand that the way that you draw near to God may be unique to you. And I think that's something to be aware of as you seek to grow in your faith and grow spiritually. The different ways that we draw near to God is something that Christians have noticed over the centuries as people have followed Jesus together. These different pathways or different categories are not specifically biblical teaching, like the Bible doesn't say these are the categories or these are the different pathways. But the Bible is full of examples of people who drew near to God in different ways. And so that's what we're talking about. For example, the Catholic tradition has identified 4 main pathways that people follow or that people tend toward in following of God. Richard Foster in his book talked about 6 different streams of the Christian faith. We looked at those several years ago in one of our adult Sunday school classes. But in this series, we're going to look at a resource developed by Gary Thomas in his book, Sacred Pathways. Sacred Pathways. We're going to refer to them as spiritual pathways. I think that's a little easier to understand. He's identified 9 different spiritual pathways. A spiritual pathway is simply the way that you most naturally connect with God and grow spiritually. A spiritual pathway is simply the way that you most naturally connect with God and grow spiritually. That's what we're talking about. So be thinking about that in your own journey. What are the ways that you most naturally connect with God, or that you most naturally enjoy prayer, or that you most naturally enjoy the scriptures, that they come to life for you? And what is the way that you most naturally grow spiritually? That's what we're talking about. Your pathway is likely different from mine. Your spiritual pathway is probably different from your spouse's. It's probably different from your parents and possibly from your children. So I think it's important for us to help us to understand something of our differences. I think it will help us looking at this will help us to understand why we sometimes get frustrated with people when we try to talk about spiritual things, or when we want to worship with people and their impulses and their instincts are just so different from our own. And I'm hoping that identifying your spiritual pathway will release you into greater freedom and into greater joy in your following of Jesus, because you'll have a clearer sense of what really lights your fires, you might say, spiritually, what brings you alive as you seek to connect with God, to draw near to God, and to grow spiritually. So let's look at the 9 pathways that Gary Thomas identifies. Again, these are not listed in the scriptures. These are just pathways that people have observed. You might think of some others, but these are, I think, this is a really helpful list. The first of the 9 pathways he identifies is the pathway of the naturalist. A naturalist is somebody who loves God best outdoors, who connects with God best in nature. Maybe if you're a naturalist, maybe you're somebody who finds that you most naturally pray when you're outdoors and you're thinking about the beauty of nature and the capacity of the God who created nature. Maybe you're somebody who prays out loud while you walk through the woods. It just comes naturally to you and is one of the primary ways that you enjoy God, that you express your devotion to God. The second pathway is that of the sensate, somebody who's most naturally connects to God through the 5 senses of seeing, hearing, smelling, touching, tasting. And so your favorite kind of worship experience is one that touches on or that draws on as many of those as possible. So maybe you like to hear bells in worship, or you like the smell of incense, or you like to taste something. We've occasionally had a table of food or different tables in our worship that we've invited people to come forward. If you're a sensate, those are probably some of your favorite services. A sensate would love God through the beauty of the church building, through the beauty of colors, through the contrast of colors, through the artwork, and so on. The third path is that of the traditionalist. A traditionalist is someone who loves God through religious ritual and symbol, especially as connected to Christian history. Probably decorations in the sanctuary, in the worship space, are very important for you. So traditionalists are probably a little disappointed with our sanctuary because it doesn't have a lot of symbols in it. If you're a traditionalist, you probably enjoy written prayers. You're probably a big fan of the Book of Common Prayer. A lot of rich, carefully thought, written out prayers for you to draw on. But just enjoys the rich traditions of Christian history and looking to Christian examples from the past. The fourth pathway is that of the ascetic. An ascetic is somebody who loves God best or most deeply in solitude and in simplicity. Someone who really enjoys quiet or being on retreat. The fifth pathway is that of the activist, somebody who loves God through taking action, who really has a passion for fighting against injustice, fighting for godly principles, for godly values. Somebody who wants to have a visible impact on their community, and who thinks that Christians who aren't as focused on that are kind of missing the point of the Christian faith. Or maybe you're on the pathway of a caregiver, the sixth pathway. A caregiver is somebody who loves God best by loving and serving other people, who worships by giving of themselves, and is energized by being with or by meeting the needs of needy and hurting people. And who thinks that Christians who aren't wired this way seem a little heartless and seem like they're kind of missing the point. The seventh pathway is that of the enthusiasts. Enthusiasts love God best through worship and celebration, through celebrative worship, they're the ones who would be shouting out in worship and have their hands in the air much of the time. Somebody for whom displays of passion and enthusiasm are really where it's at. Deep experiences of God are really where it's at. And thinking that people who aren't able to shout or really be expressive or somehow aren't really worshiping. The eighth path is that of the contemplative, somebody who loves God most richly through adoration, through attentiveness, is really interested in intimacy and sitting at the feet of Jesus, just pondering over the deep things of the faith. Probably somebody who's journaling and reflecting deeply on their journey. A temptation for a contemplative is to see people on other pathways who naturally fall into other pathways as shallow, to think they're not really plumbing the depths of Christian faith. The ninth path is that of the intellectuals, people who love God best with their minds, who are really excited and feel drawn to God when they have new insights about God or see new things in the scriptures, that things come alive and awake for them. This one is actually my default spiritual pathway, the one that I'm most familiar with and that most resonates with me. Several months ago, I realized that my personal devotional times, engagement with prayer and scripture, I was a little frustrated with them. I was feeling a little restless. And I realized that I wasn't including very much study in my devotional life and deeper reading and study. And so as I've reintroduced that, I have found that it's come alive for me again. It feels fresh and exciting to me again in a way that it wasn't before. So knowing about these 9 different pathways, does it surprise you that people who prefer different spiritual pathways pray differently? Or that they don't all find the same types of prayer forms energizing or refreshing? Does it surprise you that we all approach the scriptures somewhat differently, that we're looking for different things, or we're looking for a different kind of connection to God in and through the scriptures? I think it's important to identify these 9 pathways or think about them, because I think if we don't understand and appreciate them, you're likely to run into several different kinds of problems. Let me mention a few of them for you. One is that if you're not aware of this, if you're not thinking about these differences, you'll tend to think that your way of drawing near to God is the way to draw near to God, or the best way to draw near to God. It might be best for you, but you'll tend to think that it's the way to draw near to God. And you'll look down on other Christians who draw near in different ways, or whole other denominations, other churches that you may look down on because they don't draw near to God in the same way that you do. Several years ago, Nita and I lived in Michigan, and when we were there, we were part of a charismatic community that was wonderful for us because it introduced us to a much more joyful and wholehearted, expressive form of worship than what we had known before then. And one of the features of this community was that we would gather on Sunday afternoons for an extended, we called them worship gatherings. And that would often include an extended time, probably 40 to 45 minutes of mostly standing and singing songs. Between the songs, we would be praying out loud together, giving thanks to God in praise or in prayers of other sorts, but an extended period of time to just be soaking together with other people in a very expressive form of worship. But as I told you, my default pathway is that of the intellectual, and so I was always the evaluative part of my brain was always clicking along too. And I was thinking, okay, well, who's doing what and why are they doing that? And what does that mean? And those kind of things. I know it probably sounds tiring to some of you, but that's just how my brain works. It doesn't mean that I wasn't enjoying what I was experiencing, because I was. But I'll never forget one Sunday afternoon, I was standing in front of a dear brother who was behind me and who was attempting to participate in the expressiveness of the worship and responding to an invitation to speak in tongues, and as part of that. And what felt to me like the whole time, probably wasn't literally the whole time, but he spent a lot of the time of that period, that 45 minutes, just saying, lay, 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 lay. He was just kind of shouting that just over and over and again. And I thought, on the one hand, I thought, well, I think he's doing what he can to join in, but the intellectual part of me is thinking, what's going on there? What does that mean? Why is he doing that? And I don't think I judged him for that, but I was clearly asking some questions in my mind about somebody who was approaching God in a different way than what I was used to. I think this can also be part of what's happening when sometimes a woman will feel like maybe her husband isn't the spiritual leader in her home that she would like him to be. Sometimes what I think may be happening is that she is just familiar, she just draws near to God in a way that's different. She's on a different spiritual path, or draws near to God on a different spiritual path than her husband does. Maybe she's somebody who really enjoys study and deep conversations about lengthy readings that you do. And maybe her husband doesn't read. Maybe he's not a reader, and maybe he's not something who enjoys long and profound conversations. But maybe he's not home as much as she'd like because he's out serving other people, because he's a caregiver. He's somebody who loves God best by loving and serving other people and really has a heart for needy people. He's probably just wired differently. Now, I do realize that, guys, we can be lazy sometimes. We can be self-absorbed and reluctant to step into the responsibilities that we've taken on. But I think it's also possible that sometimes what's happening is that a husband and a wife are just wired differently, and they draw near to God in a different way. So one mistake we can make is that we think our way is the only way of approaching God. The second mistake we can sometimes make is that we will tend to copy the Christians that we most respect and feel like we need to be like them in order to be drawing near to God in an authentic way. You feel like you need to copy their style, or that somehow you're failing as a Christian if you're not drawing near to God the way they do it. Let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. One of the phrases that some Christians will use, especially enthusiasts tend to use, is they'll talk about hearing from God, that God spoke to me or God told me this. And that can be frustrating and difficult for people who aren't wired that way, because if you don't feel like you hear God say things, or you don't feel like ideas come to mind that you clearly recognize as God's, putting them there, you can tend to feel like a failure and think, wow, I just don't measure up to these people who are clearly further down the path than me, and I feel like I may never catch up. Or maybe you're somebody who's a naturalist, who worships God best in nature, and you're not as excited about or not as deeply touched by indoor structured worship like we do on Sunday mornings. And so maybe you're in worship with us on Sundays and you see someone next to you who is clearly deeply moved by the worship. Maybe their hands are in the air, and maybe there are tears streaming down their face, and you think, is something wrong with me that's not happening to me, or that I'm not responding in the same way? Well, probably not, or not necessarily. It may just mean that you're a naturalist, and that person is more of an enthusiast, or more of that we're connecting more deeply with that kind of person in that setting. I know that some of us have grew up in more traditional churches than what we are at Mount Mennonite Church. Some of you grew up with liturgy and structure in your worship services, and it came to seem dead for you, and so you want to get away from it. Others of you grew up in a church like that, and it was life-giving, and you wish actually that we were more structured, more liturgical than we are, and you kind of long for a setting that was more structured. But I know for some of you, when we read a prayer together, you kind of break out in hives or in goosebumps, because you're thinking, oh no, that's structure, that's something I wanted to get away from. That's a pathway I don't want to be on, because it didn't click for me. And I was hoping that we weren't coming back to that in this setting. So we can sometimes assume our pathway is the only one. We can sometimes try to copy the style of another person. And thirdly, we can sometimes be tempted to impose our style, our pathway, on people who are under our spiritual care, so that we tend to think that they need to follow God the way I do. This is a particular temptation for parents. Parents, you and I can, because we connect with God, we're excited about the ways that we connect with God, we can sometimes try to make our children think that that's the only way to follow God as well. We can tend to impose that on our children and assume that they're wired like we are, but some of them are not. Some of them might be, but they might not all be. And I think the more children you have, the more likely it is that at least one or two of them is going to be wired somewhat differently than you are. We naturally lead from our style, but we have to be careful not to judge our children spiritually based on how we most naturally follow God or most naturally connect with God. Because one of the things that can happen is that they can then come to judge themselves because they feel like they're not keeping up. I have a young friend who is keeping the things of God at an arm's length right now because this person grew up in a church tradition that they didn't really click with. And the Christian faith was framed in a way that they just found off-putting. And so one of the barriers to this person drawing near to God is that they think that's the only way to draw near to God. And that they know that there's something false about that. And so they haven't really fully resolved that. They're kind of keeping things at arm's length because they think that style just didn't click with them and they feel deficient because of that. If that's you, if that describes you, I hope you will consider that maybe you just have a different style of drawing near to God. I've told you in other sermons about my relationship with my younger son, Caleb. I've told you I'm more of an intellectual in terms of spiritual paths. Caleb is clearly more of an enthusiast. Now, we all have some combination of maybe, two or three of them, but I would say he's more naturally an enthusiast. I'm more naturally an intellectual. But my son is someone who loves and feels deeply. He's tender-hearted, and he just loves moving emotional experience where there's lots of excitement. And he thought that some of the churches, he tended to regard some of the churches that we attended as he was growing up as superficial, as not really fully worshiping God because the worship wasn't expressive enough. And it won't surprise you to know that as a young adult, when he worshiped, when he discovered the worship and Youth with a Mission, YWAM, he loved YWAM's worship. It comes out of the Pentecostal tradition, so it's much more like I described earlier, our community experience in Michigan, much more expressive, much more experiential in its style and focus. But I also realized, as I talked to him as he was growing older, that he wanted much more expressive expressions of my love for him. And in a fairly painful conversation as a young adult, he told me he was confused sometimes about whether or not he even loved him as he was sorting things out. Of course, I was shocked because I had tried to demonstrate, I thought I had demonstrated my love for him repeatedly over the years in lots of different, in a wide variety of ways. But we had a lovely healing conversation around that was centered around realizing that we're just wired differently. That we love each other deeply, but we're just wired differently. We tend to approach God with a different style, and that was at the heart of some of our misunderstanding. Friends, the truth is that Jesus Christ has opened the way for us, for all of us, for each of us to draw near to God, to enter directly into God's presence. Jesus Christ has removed all of the barriers for us to do that. But the way that we each do that, the way that we each most naturally do that, is going to be a little different than the way that other followers of Jesus around us do that. This is just one more opportunity for us to appreciate and respect each other's differences. It feels like we've had a lot of things like that over the last year and a half or so. Opportunities for us to appreciate and respect each other's differences. I want to give you two items of homework assignment this week, two things that you can do to prepare for next week. The first is to complete an online assessment that will help you identify your default spiritual pathway, or your home base, you might say. There's a link to an online assessment that's in the email that we sent out yesterday as a reminder of today's service. The same link is also on our website in our online resources page. It's right at the top of that page in the left column. But go to that assessment, take it, they'll email you the results, and it'll give you some understanding into how you best draw near to God, most naturally draw near to God. And once you've done that, the second piece of homework I have for you, the second assignment I have for you, is to draw near to God in a way that fits your style, in a way that fits your pathway. Draw near to God in an intentional way and shape that in some way that's intentional based on on your spiritual pathway. The next 3 weeks, we're going to talk about what that looks like, how to draw near to God from or within your style. I'm going to close today by reminding you of a verse in James 4. that talks about drawing near to God. In James 4, verse 8, James says, draw near to God, and he will draw near to you. Draw near to God, and he will draw near to you. Friends, God has already drawn near to us. He's taken the first step toward us by sending his son Jesus to open a pathway into his presence, by removing the barriers to all relationship with him. And he invites us to respond to that by drawing near to him so that he can take another step of drawing near to us. God bless you this week as you explore your spiritual pathways.